Good afternoon, everyone. How is everyone feeling? Windy, yes.
You're feeling windy.
I walked my 20-pound dog this morning and thought he was just going to blow away. Well, my name is Myles Glancy. I'm not Bruce Lamott. Bruce Lamott has lost his voice, and you kind of need a voice to interview someone. So he asked me to come up here and interview this delightful man who's sitting right next to me, Mr. Richard Egarr, who's with us this week. As you might know, he will serve as our music director starting next season, our second music director in our history. We're delighted to have him this week for an all-Bach program. And I'm just delighted that I get the honor to chat with you for a bit before this lovely program. So we're calling this program the Well-Caffeinated Clavier. Tell me about your love for Bach and how you went about curating this program.
You may be aware, but there was a very sort of popular thing happening in Europe from about the middle of the 17th century. Coffee arrived. Just slightly after cocoa. Cocoa got there first, but then coffee came in. And it really was a huge craze throughout Europe. And by the beginning of the 18th century, there were coffee houses all over the place. It got to Leipzig in 1694. The first coffee house opened there. And they became centers for people to get together, talk about stuff, almost sort of intellectual centers to discuss the latest things. And one of the coffee houses in Leipzig became super famous because it started having regular weekly concerts. And this was the Café Zimmermann. As I say, coffee, it was a sort of almost like a controlled drug, of course, like most things like that, like alcohol during Prohibition. You could get the stuff, but it was sort of under the counter. So people did take it in their homes, but it was not necessarily legal. But these coffee houses were great meeting places. And this Mr. Zimmermann was particularly fond of music. And at the beginning, just after the beginning of the century, the 18th century, he employed the Collegium Musicum from Leipzig, which was a group of university students headed by, at that time, the very famous composer George Philipp Telemann, who later he went to Hamburg and made his mark really in the city of Hamburg. But for a few years at the beginning of the 18th century, he was in charge of this Collegium Musicum in Leipzig. And they started to appear at these coffee houses. And it became so popular that by the mid-17-teens, every Wednesday night and Friday night, actually, mostly Fridays, but also some Wednesdays, between 8 and 10, there was a 2-hour performance by the Collegium Musicum. And from 1729, a certain Johann Sebastian Bach took over the Collegium Musicum. So if you were knocking around in Leipzig on a Friday evening with nothing to do, you could go into a coffee house and hear Bach and all of these amazing students performing for a couple of hours.
Sounds okay to me.
I mean, wouldn't that have been brilliant? So it was a very, very, very popular and famous thing. And the other great thing about these concerts, particularly for the ladies, coffee houses did not allow women to come in and partake of this dodgy drug. But at the concert, women were allowed to come in during the concert hours. So I'm sure there were a lot of women at these concerts just to get a good sniff of coffee and maybe have a surreptitious coffee brought to them. But the concerts were big concerts. Sometimes there were 40 musicians playing. We have one image that survives of the old coffee house. It was a 4-floor corner building, and on the ground floor there were 2 very large rooms on the ground floor in which they played these concerts. It was a big space, or a big couple of spaces. During the summer months, they actually took it out onto the patio and had it at 4 o'clock on Wednesdays in the afternoon, when I guess Leipzig in the summer, well, it's probably okay. It probably still had some dodgy weather, but not wonderful like here all the time. But if the weather was good, they would take it outside on the patio. But it was a really such an important place to gather and listen to the latest music. So he would perform some of his latest compositions, the latest stuff by Vivaldi, Telemann, Handel, some vocal stuff, whatever they fancied really. So it was a great sort of view on the music that was being published and written at the time. And the music that you'll hear in tonight's program almost certainly was heard during Bach's 10 years as director of the Collegium Musicum in this coffee house.
Well, speaking of which, let's go into talking about some of the programming that you'll hear this afternoon. One of which is one of my favorite things that Bach ever wrote, and one of the most unusual things that he ever wrote. To me, when I think of Bach, I don't immediately think of someone who composes comedy. I think of all of his delicious church music and his passions, but not a cantata that consists of just really funny text. I encourage you to read along while the coffee cantata is happening. But talk to me about how that came to be.
Well, he responding to this whole craze for the coffee in the coffee house. One of Bach's his cantata librettist, a chap known as Picander, who wrote some of the most wonderful texts for the cantatas, for the sacred music, penned the libretto for the coffee cantata. Bach wasn't the first person to set it. Yeah, I think it was about 4 years after the initial libretto was written that Bach made this version. But it gives you an idea that Picander wrote this little comic scene about coffee and the coffee house at this time, because it was such a thing. There were even magazines in Leipzig purely about coffee and the latest coffee that was coming in, and coffee and the city. So it was just such a present thing, and it touches on this whole thing about women and coffee. It's basically the very simple plot. You have a father and a daughter. The father is called Schlendrian, which in German literally translates as rut, as in stuck in a rut. So sort of old fuddy-duddy father is the idea from his name. And the young Liesken, who's probably in her late teens, and Liesken just adores coffee. And I mean really adores coffee. She just can't get enough of it. And her father, like any father and teenage daughter, worries about how he can influence this addiction for the better and do something about it. So he tries bribery. He tries saying you're not allowed to go to any wedding parties or go for walks or have the latest dress or have the baubles, the latest silver and gold baubles for your hat. And she says, no, that's fine, as long as I have my coffee. And one of the best lines in it from Liesken is, if I don't have coffee, my little cups of coffee, at least 3 times a day, I'm going to look like a shriveled up piece of goat meat. So she's absolutely she's enraptured and in raptures about coffee. And Schlendrian finally thinks that there's an aria where he says that every woman must have, or girl must have their weak spot. There must be something I can think of. And he thinks, maybe she needs a husband. So he suggests this, and Liesken pauses for a second and thinks, yes, this is what I need. I need a husband. And Schlendrian thinks he's won the battle, but actually, from the get-go, Liesken is just planning how she can get her coffee, because she secretly puts it about that any man that wants to marry her must sign a prenup saying that she can drink coffee whenever she likes. So it's a fabulous little comic scene. But just to respond to your comment about the idea that Bach was we know him from his great sacred music. At this time, we have a sort of an idea now that when you go to church and hear modern church music, well, not actually modern church music, but certainly in the 19th and 20th centuries, there's sort of composers tend to write different kinds of music for church than they do for opera. This wasn't the case in the 17th and 18th century. Take Handel or even Bach, actually. The sort of music that Bach and Handel wrote for their secular cantatas or their oratorios was exactly the same as the opera. They didn't write different music for the different. One was just religious drama, and one was just secular drama. So, I mean, we know that Bach used the same music actually for some of his secular pieces to celebrate birthdays and marriages and whatever stuff going on in Leipzig, just city stuff. He would just transpose music directly from sacred cantatas into secular cantatas. So there was no difference in thinking about the kind of music that was written for both sacred and secular. It was just drama, whether sacred or secular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we also have Nola Richardson and Cody Quattlebaum making their PBO debuts. And the lovely James Reese back with us. And we also have our lovely Steve Schultz on the flute, who kind of acts as hi Steve, kind of acts as a coffee siren, if you will. It kind of brings Nola to the other side of the stage, and there's a little bit of a dream sequence, which is just really beautiful. So let's talk about, there are two harpsichord concerti on the program that you are playing, and talk to me, because I know that at least one of these concerti existed previously as a violin concerto in a different key.
Yeah, there are two of the harpsichord concertos survive also in an earlier version as a violin concerto. The one I'm playing tonight, you will know, the first piece in the program, the G minor concerto, you will know, I'm sure, as the A minor violin concerto. One of the others, there's an E major violin concerto, which Bach took and transposed down a tone from E to D. So every time he made one of these transcriptions from a violin concerto, he transposed it down a tone. That was a sort of thing. Even the famous Bach double violin concerto, which I'm sure you all know, the famous Bach double, also survives as a double harpsichord concerto. Again, down one whole tone in C minor. So that was something I'd love to know why. There's so many questions one would love to ask composers, but that would be one of them from me. Why? And I sort of think I have an idea that because the harpsichord is absolutely not a violin. The violin is a wonderful, beautiful, fabulously expressive instrument. The harpsichord isn't. It is, in the words of Monty Python, the machine that goes ping. And one has to do everything for it. There are lots of ways of trickery to try and make it an expressive instrument, which I won't go into now. But basically, essentially, all it does is go ping. So there are ways of manipulating it to make it seem expressive. So I hope I can convince you that that's possible. But it was a big leap of faith on Bach's part to allow this instrument out from its usual role as an accompanying instrument, a chordal, playing chords and harmony and rhythm, to be a concerto instrument, because that's not its natural space, if you like. And the first person to make that leap of faith was Bach in the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto, where for the first time in music history, the harpsichord becomes part of a concerto group for the harpsichord, violin, and flute. But he went further and decided that because he was a great keyboard player, he thought that this medium of the concerto for harpsichord had some possibilities. So he started exploring it by making some transcriptions from the violin concertos of the music. And as I said, the A minor violin concerto is a fantastically lively, vibrant, exciting piece, even though it's in a minor key. What happens when Bach transcribes, and this was the first one that he worked on, the first transcription that he worked on of these harpsichord concertos. He took it down this tone, he takes it down into G minor. And it's not just the fact that it's lower, but the key itself has a different quality, especially in the old tuning system, which is unequal. I don't need to go into that now, but it gives it, and the music is the same pretty much, but it gives it a sort of a darkness and a slightly stormy quality, which the violin concerto doesn't have. And of course, the violin is a single line instrument. It just plays one line in its concerto. Having two hands, Bach adds lots of stuff in the left hand for the harpsichord, and there are more polyphonic possibilities for the harpsichord to release in this concerto. So it's a fascinating study of Bach's mind at work making this transcription. The other concerto, the D minor concerto, is possibly Bach's greatest concerto in this form, this harpsichord concerto. It's really a keyboard piece, and it was probably not designed for himself to play, but maybe one of his very talented sons, either Wilhelm Friedemann or Carl Philipp. Well, I'll come to that in the concert. There's a little story about that I don't want to tell you, but it's full of just sort of flashy keyboard stuff all over the place. There have been transcriptions. There's a whole industry in musicological circles about Bach transcriptions, and a lot of people say, oh, there must be a violin original version of this, because he did make these transcriptions from violin. There's no actual evidence for that with this piece. Every version of this piece survives with a keyboard. Even in a cantata, the first two movements survive with the organ playing the keyboard part. And as I've already mentioned, whenever Bach took the keyboard version from the violin, he always transposed it down a tone. Every time. So if there was a surviving version for violin, it would be upper tone in E minor. That would be the logical thing to assume that would happen. And all of the transcriptions I've seen of the violin version just stick to the key of D minor. And there are the sort of things that people say. There's a lot of stuff in the first movement, particularly of the concerto, that looks like violin writing, looks like stuff that Vivaldi wrote. And Vivaldi was a huge influence for Bach for the concerto, all the violin concertos. Bach made transcriptions of lots of Vivaldi for the harpsichord of his concertos. So Bach learnt his concerto trade by studying these violin concertos. And like Liszt later, who adored Paganini, and we have the Paganini etudes from Liszt, inspired by Paganini's violin technique. A lot of these things that happen in the first movement of this concerto are inspired by Vivaldi's violin technique. They look like violin writing. But that's about all you can say in certain terms of real evidence for this. But it's a brilliant concerto for harpsichord. So yeah, it's fun to play.
Well, it just, to me, and just in general, it kind of reminds us that anything is possible. This like continuo instrument, what was and what could have still been a continuo instrument that's very limiting. Yeah. Bach took it out from behind the band and said, look at this, and then he really paved the way for people like Mozart and Beethoven, and the evolution of the harpsichord into a forte piano, and now the modern piano recitals, all of our kids taking piano lessons. It's just he paved the way for this little engine that could.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, it was in the air, because in Britain, in England, we have Handel doing something similar. He sort of created the organ concerto there when he was doing his oratorios. So the idea of a keyboard coming out and being a concerto instrument was certainly in the air, but the organ is a very different animal from a harpsichord. So, but the idea of, and I guess with people like Handel, these great keyboard players, it was going to happen. It was going to happen at some point. Somebody would get the idea. And of course, the harpsichord was, don't forget that pianos were already around. The earliest pianos are from 1720. And there are a pair of instruments by Silbermann Cristofori in Leipzig itself. One is a harpsichord and one is an early fortepiano. They look identical. From the outside, they are completely identical. So, I mean, the piano was already sort of making its way, but it would have happened at some point.
Right. And then we bring the trumpets, timps, and oboes on stage and play one of Bach's 4 orchestral suites, this one, number 3. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, this was another thing which was very much the fashion in Germany, the orchestral suite. It is sort of formed from what was going on in France and in Austria at the end of the 17th century, taking a bunch of dance movements and sticking them together in a suite. The orchestral suite was particularly especially in the opening movement of these orchestral suites, was a big piece of pure music called the Overture, which involved whichever instruments the piece was written for. And it took the form of the French Overture that was arrived at the end of the 17th century, which is a sort of healthy, generous, slow introduction with a very prominent dotted rhythm going all the way through it, followed by a very swift, exciting fugue, fugal movement. Sometimes that would return, quite often it would return to the opening slower section, but it's usually a very substantial piece of music, so 7 or 8 minutes, which for Baroque music is quite long. And thereafter, in these orchestral suites, pretty much anything went. I've already mentioned Telemann. He wrote loads and loads of these orchestral suites. One of my favorites I've been telling people about was called the Alistair Overture. It was written for the city of Hamburg and contains all sorts of references to water, Hamburg being this incredibly important port. But one of the movements takes us to, obviously, a very large pond somewhere where there are an incredible amount of frogs. And the orchestra consists of 4 natural horns, so the old-style horns with no valves, who basically, and the movement is titled a Concert of Frogs. And are these 4 horns imitating frogs, going, making frog noises. Extraordinary.
And this would have been premiered in the cafe as well?
No, it might have been, because we know that there were certainly horns around in Leipzig and in Dresden particularly, but that piece was given its premiere in Hamburg. So basically, the world was a composer's oyster as far as these overtures went. Bach was quite conservative in his choice of movements. We have minuets, we have passe-pieds, we have bourrées, gavottes. In this third suite, which is one of only the 4 which survived from Bach, he probably wrote more, but we just don't have the music for them. And it was surely premiered in the cafe, the Zimmermann's cafe, with the trumpets and oboes and timpani.
3 Baroque trumpets in a cafe.
Yeah, it was a big space. Yeah. It was a big space. We know that the cafe owned 2 horns and 2 double basses and a harpsichord and a number of string instruments. So it was a space. And don't forget, Baroque trumpets are not as loud as a modern symphony orchestra's trumpets. Thank goodness. So we have this wonderful opening movement, this very, very fantastic, energetic fugue, which such a spectacular fugue. And after this very excited first movement with the full orchestra, with the trumpets and oboes and strings, Bach had a stroke of genius, of course. He just leaves us, after this noise, with something called Aair, A-I-R, which has become perhaps the most famous piece of Western music. You will know it as the Aair on a G string. You've heard it everywhere. You've heard it in elevators, on hold to Delta Airlines or whatever. It's just, it is a piece which pretty much everybody will know. And the reason is, like all of these famous pieces, like Pachelbel Canon or Eine kleine Nachtmusik, they are perfect pieces of music. And this it's genius, because we get rid of all the noise of that first movement, and he just has this extraordinary, beautiful movement with 4 extraordinary, beautiful string parts. And it is utter perfection. It's a joy to play it every time, even though it's famous, but it is famous for a very, very good reason.
Let's switch gears from guest conductor to our new music director next year. And let's just talk a little bit about your season next year that you've curated, which is quite exciting. You call yourself a musical omnivore, musical addict. And it goes to show, if you pick up one of our season brochures in the lobby, there are programming from Purcell to Tchaikovsky. Tell us about why you call yourself a musical addict and how that informed your first season with us.
Well, I guess like Liesken, the daughter of Schlendrian, she's a coffee addict. I've always been a music addict ever since I can remember. Neither of my parents were musicians. My father loved music, but he loved musicals, Oklahoma, all these great old musicals, and we used to, the only records we had at home were of people like Rosemary Clooney, Doris Day. My father still loves Doris Day to this moment, still in love with her. So that was the kind of music, these great singers, crooners from the 50s. That's the stuff I grew up listening to. And I didn't really come across classical music till I started learning the piano when I was 6 or so. And then when we moved to York, just at the north of England, I had a wonderful piano teacher for a year in the village, just outside York. And she suggested that I should go and audition for the cathedral choir in York, the Minster Choir. And York is the second cathedral in the UK after it has an archbishop, like Canterbury. So Canterbury and York are the two. And I'd never sung really in earnest. She gave me a few pointers, and I went and auditioned for the choir, and I got in. So at the age of 9, having listened to Doris Day and Rosemary Clooney, I was then singing William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, and just this incredible repertoire. And because we had 9 services a week at York, we sang 9 services during a week. We had rehearsals twice a day. We didn't sing on Wednesdays, but I just had music. Music came. There's all sorts of different kinds of music. So I've always had a very, very broad appetite for music. If it's good music, I'm interested in it. People love to pigeonhole you and say, oh, he's a specialist in this, that, and the other, and that's fine if people are only comfortable in. But I've always had this sort of omnivorous thing with music. I know if it's good music, I'm interested in it. So.
It's definitely addicting. Talk to me about how we're going to open the season. We have this spectacular Beethoven extravaganza planned. 4 hours of music. 4 hours. You
Bring a
heard me
pillow.
correctly.
Bring a pillow.
With a 2-hour break for dinner. It's like Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, if you've seen it in San Francisco already. Talk to us about how you, you of course didn't conceive it, Beethoven did, but why start things off?
Well, you're probably all aware that 2020 is a big Beethoven anniversary year. You're not going to escape Beethoven. I mean, pretty much every symphony orchestra is doing Beethoven symphony cycles, it's great, but there's going to be lots of Beethoven around, and I just thought it would be a really exciting and interesting project to recreate this mammoth concert, at which there was the premiere of the 5th and the 6th symphony. Beethoven played the 4th piano concerto. We have bits of the Mass in C, great vocal works, and the whole thing was capped off with a performance of the choral, the literally newly composed choral fantasy. I mean, the ink was actually not even on the paper for some of it. Beethoven even improvised the opening fantasy. I thought it would be a fascinating and hopefully wonderful experience for everybody, not just you as an audience, but also for us as an orchestra to experience what these kinds of events were like. We're so sort of used to, a concert is an hour and 3/4 and we have a 15-minute interval, and that's what a concert is. That was not what a concert was until the 20th century, actually. The concert was always quite a fluid thing. So I think it's nice to occasionally to experience these weird and wonderful events of past. But we won't do it that often, because 4 hours is a long time to concentrate. But I think it's going to be a wonderful thing to celebrate this Beethoven anniversary year, to recreate this concert.
I think so too. We'll be scheduling in more rehearsal time than Beethoven did, right? Well, Richard, I could talk to you for hours, but it's such a delight to talk to you on stage here. Thank you for being with us this week. We're looking forward to your tenure with us, and enjoy the concert.
Thank you.